Welcome back. You are watching the Crux, coming to you live from Channel Television Studios here in Abuja. Now, before the break, we started discussing some of the challenges that the aviation industry is facing in this country. I want to bring Captain Mukhtar Shuaibu Usman as the person who heads the regulatory agency, which sort of oversees part of what happens in the aviation sector. From your point of view, what do you think are the biggest challenges that the sector faces?
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying aviation is the most regulated industry in the world. Having said that, we have standards and recommended practices as regulated or commanded by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is headquartered in Montreal, Canada. Yes, there are challenges, and the challenges have been identified by the government, especially in the running of the airlines. You mentioned something earlier that a lot of airlines have come and gone, and government has looked at holistically the problems, mainly centered around the lack of corporate governance in those entities, poor management. And of course, we had challenges with fuel availability.
There's some who would believe that actually the reason you see an airline, for example, like ARIC, go into receivership is actually because there's been a failure of institutions and agencies such as yours who are not regulating like they should. They're not checking the books. They're not doing all the things that they should. And then you have an airline like ARIC that keeps having issues until it gets to a situation where everything folds up completely. Would you accept that as a valid criticism of regulators in the sector?
No, certainly not. I've said before that several airlines came and left, and we have identified the major problems as lack of proper governance, corporate governance, and that we're trying to put in place. Poor management, the government has identified that, and in line with that, in trying to address that problem, government has commenced the process of establishing an aerospace university to address the high-level manpower required to manage the aviation sector.
So you see it as a manpower issue, precisely.
Correct.
Let me bring in the only sort of private sector person who plays in the aviation sector. From the perspective of the private sector and someone who works in the infrastructure part of the business, Dr. Babalakin, what are the challenges?
Thank you very much. They are numerous, but I will start by addressing them. The first one, the infrastructure deficit, is a deliberate position of government not to develop it.
Now, why would government want to not develop infrastructure?
Okay.
It doesn't sound logical.
Okay, it's empirical. If you've been doing the same thing for 63 years and it has continued to fail, doesn't that tell you that there's something wrong with the system? You mentioned now that, is it a systemic failure? It is systemic failure that is all-encompassing. The example of ARIC you mentioned, I won't sit down here and join in criticizing ARIC. ARIC could have its own issues, but the system indulged ARIC. The system overlooked all the breaches of agreements, of understanding, and allowed it to compound the problems until a stage where they could no longer tolerate it.
Dr. Babalaki, when you talk of systems,
yes,
the lay people sitting down and listening to you talk, it's almost like you're talking about this faceless mammoth that seems to consume things. It's almost like you can't hold anybody responsible or accountable.
Okay. You should ask the regulators, when did ARIC begin to breach agreements or breach processes? How long did it take to respond to those breaches? When did ARIC stop paying whatever dues it ought to pay? How long did it take to respond to those issues. What was done to ensure compliance? I'm taking you one by one.
We don't have too much time, unfortunately, so I'm going to, occasionally interrupt.
Engineer Olowo mentioned, and he mentioned it, is a systemic failure. Even the media contributed to the failure.
So there are institutional problems. That's Mr. Showole, that's what he seems to be saying. There are institutional issues within the aviation sector.
Yes. Now, let me take two examples. I want to take the Abuja airport and ARIC. Okay. Now, if you look at the domestic terminal in Abuja, I think it must have been about 8 or 10 years ago, government had people bid to take over. It was going to be privatized. And a particular company won, and they put a deposit of over $10 million. And having held on to the funds for a while, government then said they were not interested any longer. And it took that company over about 3-4 years to get the funds back. Now, what did the government do to that terminal? They converted it to a private jet terminal. That was a terminal that could take 5 Boeing 737 passengers seated right there. You convert it to a private jet terminal where you don't get more than 100 passengers flying out of there on a daily basis. And then you move the domestic to the international, and you have a situation where an 80-year-old or a 70-year-old passenger or 75-year-old passenger has to walk up the staircase to go to that terminal, and then he walks down again. How can government do that to Nigerians? It's not fair on Nigerians. So I think the failure of the infrastructure, the failure of aviation in Nigeria is at the doorstep of the government. Now let's take ARIC.
Okay, but very quickly, because time, and we need to get through quite a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So very, very quickly, please.
So if you take ARIC, now why do these airlines fail? Take it in percentages. I would say that government has 80% of the blame of the collapse of these airlines. We have the refineries that don't work. There's no aviation fuel. We know what percentage that takes in operation of an aircraft. All the numerous charges government places on these airlines. They can't cope. Invariably, they will collapse. Another key factor is the nature of how the government allows the international airlines to work all over Nigeria.
Okay, let me stop you here, because we have representatives of governments here, agencies that are run by government, and I'd like to bring them in. People like to say that government is a continuum, but in this country, actually, it hardly ever is. Some people say that's a problem, that every time a new government comes in, you get new policies, new directions. From your point of view, these issues that have been discussed by the two independent people we have sitting here who are involved in the sector, what is the stance of this particular administration regarding some of those issues? Are you doing anything different from what we've seen in the past? Because like Dr. Babala King pointed out, things haven't been working.
Yeah, yes, government is a continuum, and government of the day has looked at the issues that we have in the aviation industry, and of course they are being addressed. It's difficult to make certain corrections in an industry like the aviation industry because it's huge. We have there is an infrastructure gap that has been identified, and government is addressing that.
Specifically how?
Yeah, of course, the new terminals that have been built in Abuja, Port Harcourt, Lagos, Enugu, and Kano airports, which have reached an advanced stage of completion, which will be completed sometime this year, maybe by the middle of this year. If that is done,